Thank you, Anne, and thank you, guys. That was lively. That was awesome. Great conversation. I'm going to welcome Karen up. We have a really quick transition, but Karen, welcome.
I've been here before. I'm really excited about this next panel. Actually, every panel has been better than I could have expected, but this one is unique in that I've been to lots and lots and lots of grid conferences. We talk about grid operations, markets, data, meters, customers, DER, planning, but I have never been to a grid conference where we talked about the backbone of the grid, which is the utility pole. And given the, and if you, Mark, I was watching your video, and I saw that there were several seconds of drawing the utility line and the wires and the poles, which are, really the foundational network that is the grid. So we're going to start off with a presentation by Andrew Phillips from EPRI, because EPRI has done a significant amount of research on the utility pole over the years. And then we're going to have a panel discussion with a group of people who work very closely managing the stock of utility poles in this country. So join me in welcoming Andrew to the podium.
Good morning, everyone. If you know me, I've spent 26 years, some of those overlapping with Mark at EPRI, helping utilities dream. I thought that was fantastic. And I thought, the other thing that I thought was fantastic is that you went and you helped utilities realize their dream. And I think, hopefully today, you're going to see how EPRI dreams are being realized by utilities. It's pretty clear to everybody, if we're going to go to this decarbonized, electrified, and digitized future, increasing the capacity of the existing grid, T and D, is vital. It has to be done, right? And we're always thinking about new technologies, building new lines, but as Larry and Mark said, we have to worry about the existing infrastructure. It is the foundation on which everything is built, the existing infrastructure. If the existing infrastructure is not reliable, is not resilient, there's no way we can do this. And right at the middle of that existing infrastructure is the utility pole, all right? The distribution utility pole in this case. And I think we've got a few slides ahead. If you could help me going backwards would be fantastic. One of the important parts that we found with our members, we have about 80 members working with us on distribution poles. If you carry back a little, I think you're going the wrong way. And there's no need to have sound, unlike Mark. Can't win, is that when you're looking at resiliency, it's not just about making things harder. Resiliency includes recovery. And speeding up recovery is vital. If we look how long it takes to recover a distribution pole, if the pole breaks, it takes about 24 hours to replace it. And that's surveying over 45 utilities that are part of EPRI. If the cross arm breaks, it takes about 6 hours. That's a lot faster. It's a lot quicker. There's less logistics. And so EPRI has been working with its members over the last, I would say, 8 to 9 years to work out how can we make something break that is not the pole? How can we make something sacrificial? And you could do it by doing calculations of static loads, but it turns out that doesn't work. And so we built this test site up in Lenox, Massachusetts, and I'm going to hopefully see if I can get a video to play. If someone could help me at the back, play just one video. But you can see what it does is it simulates a tree coming down and hitting the wires. Hopefully it's going to fall. And when you do that, you get these dynamic loads. And these dynamic loads are quite different to any static load. And if we could go and design, the concept is if we could go and design the structure that the crossarm would fold rather than the pole break, that the conductors would slip out of their fittings instead of the pole break. If a nut and a bolt could pull out, it would be much better. And it actually means making some things weaker than it used to be. All right, so I'm going to hope, here is hopefully where you'll see one type of construction. You can see how the pole breaks. That's a standard, from a utility that they used all those years. We spent months testing their structures, coming up with new structures. And you saw, instead of that happening, actually turns out that the pins on the insulators bend for the same load. And so reducing that time to go and make the replacement. At the moment, 13 different utilities have come to the EPRI test site, tested their structures, and implemented changes to their designs to make them more resilient. Some of them have changed their existing designs. Some of them have come up with totally new designs. And just one quote from one member, in terms of their measured SAIDI after 2 different circuits in the same area after a storm with almost the same amount of tree strikes, was about a 10% increase in SAIDI. And so as we do what Larry talked about, build back that existing infrastructure that we need to have, right? We need to do it with structures that are more resilient, not just stronger, but also more resilient. Also in the future for us are composite structures. Wood is a natural product, but composite is an engineered product. It's glass, fiberglass, in an epoxy resin with a coating on the outside. It seems like an obvious choice. It's lighter, it's easier to get to the field, but there are a bunch of things that come with it. We don't know how to inspect it. We don't know how to assess it. We don't know how to actually attach everything to it that it's going to last for 50 to 60 years. And so we are doing research on all of those pieces of the puzzle. Also, it may seem like it's stronger and it's going to bend a bit more, so when the structure gets hit by a pole, by a tree, it's going to be tougher. But it turns out that when you do that, if you don't design it correctly, you end up putting big cracks in it, and it's actually a little worse in a way than a wood pole. And so you need to think about all those things. And so EPRI is working with its members to understand all of those pieces of the puzzle. And then one other place that we're dreaming is thinking about supply chain. We are worried today that we don't have enough wood poles. I don't know if all of you guys are worrying with supply chain not getting enough wood poles, especially Class A wood poles that are super strong. And so the question is, can we use Class 3 or Class 4 poles and get the same resilience and same reliability out of it that we've got from Class A poles? And so those first two efforts, composite poles and more resilient structures, being implemented. Utilities are doing it today. They've been doing it for the last 5 years and seeing the benefits of it. But with the supply chain that's come and hit us really hard, everything, transformers, you know it all. New methods to come up with, to utilize poles that are more readily available and get the same reliability and resiliency and life expectancy are things that we're working on. And I'm going to hand back to Karen, but I hope that set the stage for you about talking about how important that pole is and a lot of the new things that are being done.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'm going to ask the rest of the panel to come up to the front so we can start the panel. And I will remind you that there is at least $11 billion in the infrastructure bill for resilience. Specifically, there are 2 different programs, or 3, depending on how you look at how DOE's divided it up. And in the what I call the true deployment money, the first set of eligible entities is the true hardening of the grid, which will involve specifically mentioning the poles. So there's going to be, I think, a big churn in the stock of utility poles, and so it made sense to have some experts here talking about that. So I'm going to start by asking Carson Zerpa from Itron, who's a senior business growth manager, to talk about what Itron is doing in terms of what's on the pole.
Sure. So there's a
Oh,
slide,
here's,
right?
am I?
Yeah. So, I just hit this button here, I guess. Okay. So, what I have here is, and there are probably a lot of folks sitting in the room saying, what's a meter guy going to be talking about a pole here? And just to give you guys some context, ex-distribution engineer, worked for Florida Power and Light for a number of years. I have designed and framed a number of distribution and transmission poles in my career. And where does Itron play a role for distribution poles? So when I think about the future of grid resiliency and kind of looking at the backbone of the distribution infrastructure from a pole perspective, there's the physical, there's the digital, And then there's the concept of what are we going to do to modernize our distribution standards, and all those things kind of have to converge on each other based on the context of how we're changing our way that we operate in the utility space. So as we move more to distributed generation, the needs for distributed computing, very similar to the sessions we saw in the last discussion about needing the needs for sensors to understand what's happening from a renewables perspective in the grid, as well as the need to understand fundamentally how we engage our customers. We need that fine resolution data. So from a physical perspective, that turns into what sensors can give me the visibility of what's taking place in my distribution system. So if you think about it, as a utility, you have, from an asset perspective, this wealth of devices spread out across your service territory at varying heights in different districts. What better way to get hypersensitive weather local data to drive managing renewables? So by bolting on different types of sensors, whether it be wind speed sensors, solar irradiance sensors, anything that would give you kind of the visibility of what's happening in real time, sharing that technology and sharing the decision making with the same granularity that we talked about in previous sessions, where we put the intelligence in the edge devices to make decisions. Those sensors can share that data locally and gives you the ability to respond and manage the grid. So your pole is no longer just a wood pole that just, for all intents and purposes, holds the conductors. It allows you visibility of what's happening in the grid to respond. So from my perspective, from a sensor provider, before you can do anything, first you've got to kind of understand what's happening. You have to have visibility of what's taking place. Once you have visibility, you need to understand how to manage it. And once you have management, you want to push the control. And so with sensors on, what's the next generation of distribution pole, you have that flexibility to kind of truly allow these edge computing and edge control type of use cases to take place autonomously. And I think you heard from the DSO discussion, quote unquote, in the last session, that we want to automate these things. We want to take the human out of the decision making. So the need to have this hypersensitive sensors on these devices that are correspondingly locally with controllable assets like inverters, EV chargers, microgrid controllers. Fundamentally every single pole in your system gives you kind of that potential of driving those decision making. So that was the kind of the core piece of that. And from an analytics perspective, kind of what you see on, I guess it's looking back right on the right side of the screen there. Sorry, you can see what we're doing from this perspective is when we look at distribution poles, from a resiliency perspective, I kind of do the pole and line kind of discussion. And so when we look at the incremental data from a usage perspective, taking that asset virtually into your GIS system and layering the data that you get from various sensors gives you the ability to look at high impedance models and basically understand where you might need to harden those connections, or where you might have failing connections, where the capacity of the system won't accommodate additional EVs. And so you can see kind of a study we did with a client there in real time with the data from their systems going up to those assets, and basically identified every pole where we need to harden the secondary bus to accommodate one incremental EV on that either transformer or service bus. And so that's kind of the high level that I thought from a sensor perspective we could kind of give you guys some visibility to. And then just to kind of point out, I mean, this is a little bit outside of grid resiliency, but from a sensor standpoint, I think we're seeing a lot of folks with the whole, stuff that's happening recently with the substation security issues, naturally, having video, access on those same distribution poles, providing, gunshot detection to improve your communities and things of that nature are all things that are in the, applications that are supported by sensors that you can bolt on poles. And fundamentally, now that you're thinking about adding assets to that pole, your design standards are going to change because your wind loading and all these other things need to factor in the burden of these new assets on those poles. So, our distribution pole, for all intents and purposes, is going to be quite smart here in the near future as we continue to don these technologies.
Thanks, Carson. I'm going to totally own myself, and I was very particular. I was asking Josh, are you going to line everybody up in order and as they're going to sit? And then I just went completely out of order. So, next speaker is Chad Newton, who's the Senior Director for Wood Portfolio Services at Osmose.
Sorry.
There you go. Thank you all for having me today. Is this on? There we go. Thank you. So as she mentioned, I am from Osmose. We are a contractor that works for many utilities across the country. We assess the structures that hold up the grid. You're talking about how we want to talk about what holds up the grid, all the overhead lines, all those structures. We end up touching over 3 to 5 million structures per year, about 3 million wood structures, or at least visiting them every single year. And so we have a lot of experience around a number of different things as it relates to wood poles. I've just kind of listed a lot of the things that Osmose does for our utility clients. And around specifically wood poles, doing structural integrity assessment, preservative application in the field, strengthening those structures or restoring those structures, and doing the analysis for pole loading, joint use management, things of that nature. And as I've heard in a number of talks through where I've been able to attend here, the environment is changing, not just the utility environment, but the environment itself. Here you see a map of billion-dollar extreme weather events that have occurred in the last 20 or so years. And there's quite a few of them, many hurricanes, tropical storms, large tornado-type straight-line wind type of events, wildfires. All of those affect the wood utility pole to the point of, can we make those utility poles more resilient to withstand them? And how do we protect them in the case of fire from getting damaged in those types of events? Now, Osmose has assisted utilities in a number of different areas. Utilities themselves have been focused on enhanced analysis and hardening their overhead lines. They've developed the smart monitoring through smart grid devices, different strategic undergrounding, although as we know, undergrounding can be quite expensive, so doing that strategically where it makes sense has been a focus. Updating their mutual assistance programs and really having more enhanced vegetation management to try to minimize some of those tree impacts that you were showing on your video earlier. So what we at Osmose feel is that poles are critical to your overall resiliency strategy, and it's more from the standpoint of making your structures more resilient to those weather events. We attack it in kind of a two-prong approach. We focus on the structural health by doing proper assessments of the condition of the pole, not just above ground, but also below ground as well, assessing for decay and damage below ground, because that's what's going to weaken your pole in the area of the pole where it needs the most strength. And then also having more targeted resiliency, understanding through pole load modeling across your system in an analytics-driven way where your weak points are to maybe above and beyond what the National Electric Safety Code would have you build to. Just to give you an example of real-world work of the 3 million or so poles that we touch and do these types of inspections on every year, there are manual processes with technicians trained in how to properly inspect a wood utility pole that goes from visual assessment, sounding it with a hammer. They're trained on how to listen for and feel for different decay pockets that may come. Excavating the pole is really the best and most accurate way in identifying decay that's happening with the pole. Boring into the pole, looking for decay that has started internally. And then in some cases, partial excavation is used and maybe different levels of intrusiveness to the utility pole is used based on the budgets that utilities want to fund this type of work. What we find is that full excavates are often going to find 98% or more of your ground line issues with decay. But through a study that we've actually just recently coming close to concluding with real world data of upwards of 10,000 or more inspections, understanding what the effectiveness of finding those true ground line rejects are, if you were to only walk up to a pole and look at it, you may only find 0 to 10% of the true problems that you have out there. Where you just hit it with a hammer, you may only find 5 to 15% of your problems. Boring into the pole may get you a little bit more accurate in finding all the issues that you have, and then looking below ground does improve a little bit. One concept just to introduce people to is something called condition-based inspections, where you start with a less invasive inspection, and then if you find any evidence of decay, you follow up with a full excavation. That'll allow you to achieve more accurate inspections if you're not able to budget for the full excavate on every pole, or every pole that would be of an age that would make sense to do. You're not going to do that on a pole that was set yesterday. So that optimized life extension program looks like having enhanced assessments, arresting decay with preservatives to extend the useful life of these poles and retain as much original strength to that structure as possible, and looking at engineered restoration systems for poles that have been weakened in the ground line to build back strength into their ground line zone. And these application of preservative treatments does extend the useful life of these assets, allows them to stay in service with the appropriate amount of strength to be resilient in the grid. Now, that health program directly impacts your structural resiliency, but being more targeted with your analysis can help you identify what specific structures may be weak even to begin with, even with the day they were put in the ground, and with everything that's been attached to them now with new third-party attachers, you're not able to withstand the extreme weather events. So we look at all sorts of maps. We have decay zone maps, we have straight line wind event maps, all publicly available data, but using that to focus on how do we strengthen the wood utility poles, hurricane tracks, wildfire hazard zones. Much of the distribution wood overhead lines are built to the National Electric Safety Code in this district loading. Much of this loading may not be sufficient enough to resist some of these more extreme weather events that are happening around the coast and even the straight line winds that are happening in the middle of the country. So we start to look at guidance, even though not required, to these extreme wind contours and starting to design lines, or at least main line feeder lines, to an extreme wind consideration, understanding the probability of these higher wind speeds occurring and designing to those. So there's summer storms and then even winter storms of wind and concurrent ice. And so we go out and we actually collect a lot of data about the structures in situ, what's in the field today, work through pole load modeling, and then apply solutions if needed for any poles that fall below the requirement of whatever load case a utility is looking to harden to. And taking those insights from the analysis and recommending actions through replacements with stronger structures, looking at trussing solutions to strengthen the structures, enhancing your inspection techniques, and maybe even looking for areas in the high fire zones to apply asset fire protection products to it. And just a quick case study of a utility that really invested a lot in their structural resiliency. After getting hit with Hurricane Wilma, and they continue to invest in their resiliency and have seen great success in the recent, was it Ian that was hit? Large reduction in pole failures, which allows them to come back online faster and restore power to the grid much faster. And I believe this is all in the packet of information, but just put out a few white papers that for later reading about some of the topics I covered here today.
And I do believe we have a resources section on the GridCONNEXT website that has the resources from all of our speakers who've contributed to them. So we've heard about the pole itself, we've heard about the sensors and other technologies that are deployed on the pole, and now we're going to hear from Matt Fauver, who's a journey lineman and engineering and operations data analysis with Rappahannock Electric Co-op, to talk about who's doing the work, what does the work look like, and is that work changing, and the nature of the work as both the conditions, the working conditions, and the technologies change. Matt?
Yes, sir, thank you. My name is Matt Fauver. I'm from Rappahannock Electric Cooperative here in Virginia. I've got a pretty unique background. I've been a lineman for over 10 years now, and in about 2 weeks, I'll be switching over to the engineering and operations data analyst. But technology is changing every day, it seems like, from the equipment that we put on the poles to the tools that we use as linemen to the data analytics that we use to try to prevent outages before they even happen. As far as the equipment goes that we put on poles, we've gone from OCRs, so oil circuit reclosers, to new electronic reclosers, which are great. If they're set up right and everything's okay with them, they'll tell you how far down the line a fault is. They're a lot faster. They'll operate in hundreds of milliseconds, which could go from you seeing a big arc to you not seeing anything at all. We've got electronic capacitor banks now that monitor the line. They open and close as needed. And we've also got substations that have auto switching on them. So if we lose a substation, they will automatically switch around and backfeed themselves to help cut down on major outages. But some of the biggest innovations here, especially in the last 3 to 5 years, is honestly in the tools that we use as linemen. When I started, we still had the old hand crimps and everything that was hard on your body. And between Milwaukee, Husky, and Hilti, they pretty much make a battery tool for everything that we do, which is a lot easier on us. It makes us more efficient, and it's easier on our body. But there's 3 major improvements that I've seen in my career that I go a little more in depth about. One is, I think in 2014, Salisbury started testing a new rubber for the rubber gloves and sleeves. And that has been just the biggest game changer for us, because I don't know, oops, sorry. Sorry. But I don't know if any of y'all ever tried on gloves and sleeves, but they're awful, to be honest. And these new gloves are a lot thinner. They still have the same installation value, and they let us do our job and make it a little bit easier. The other big improvement on our everyday side has been the remote control digger derrick. This has been great. So our digger derricks from Altec come in now. They actually have a remote control. It goes around your waist or around your neck, however you want. You can control the boom from anywhere. So you can walk around the truck and do whatever. Traditionally, when I started, you had a guy that either sat on top of the boom or there was a platform on the side of the truck that he used. And it was hectic. So you had to go over and get the hole started with him, and then you were running over trying to frame the pole and then trying to keep up with him while he was doing his thing. Where now with the remote control, the guy running the derrick can do everything as far as digging the hole. He can clean off his auger, he can do whatever he wants, and that allows you to concentrate on framing up the pole. So it makes us way more efficient, less people, and in all honesty, it's safer. When we get into some tight situations with setting poles in 3-phase and other situations, you used to have to rely on someone telling you what to do. Now you don't. You can go walk around, you can see for yourself. It's a way better way to do things. On the trouble side of things, one of the biggest helpers for us are drones. So we've got a drone just on about every truck now. More and more people are getting licensed to fly them in our company. And our territory is very diverse. So we cover 22 counties in Virginia. We go from the Blue Ridge Mountains to the Tidewater region. And in the mountain section, we've got some lines that take 6 or 8 hours to patrol. So you've got 3 or 4 guys hiking in. They find the problem. They've got to hike back out. You've got to come up with a plan, hike back in. Where with drones, within 5 minutes, I can have a drone deployed, and within 25 minutes, look at that line, see where the problem's at, come up with a plan on how to come in. So we only have to go in and out one time, which is has been very beneficial for our members and our outage restoration times. On the data analytics side, we've come up with an app that we just deployed for our foresters, and we're getting ready to deploy it to our linemen. But it allows them to go out on any tree calls outage, and they can open up this app. It'll get their geolocation. They can take a picture, fill out a short form. All that information comes back to us, and if we find patches where a lot of trees have been coming down, what we'll do is the foresters will go out and they'll start checking soil or why are we having all these outages here. Once they figure out the cause, whether it's a grove of dead trees or a soil condition causing it, they'll take that data to the member and try to widen the right of way. A lot of times that works. If you've got a cause, members they'll let you do it. The other thing is if you hit a grove of dead trees, members will let us go 20, 30, 40 foot outside of our right of way and cut all their dead trees, which has been a huge thing for us here lately. So that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Matt. I'm going to stick with you for a second because you mentioned a whole set of things that have changed for your day-to-day work. What does that mean for the training and skills that either a new line person should have or somebody who's been doing it for 10 years or so?
So everything's changing, even the training and everything. The schools are getting better that they go to. They're learning more and more. What I have found with the digger derrick, which is pretty interesting, is we've got a lot of new guys now that are 19 to 21 years old, and they've come up playing video games, and they've got the controls, and they are fantastic on that derrick. Like it's honestly been a game changer for us. So
That's great.
yeah.
That's great. You mentioned, I think a couple of you have mentioned the changing climatic conditions. There's a picture right there of the, ice loads and things like that. And then also the changing number of devices that might be deployed on the pole itself. And both of those things change the load structure, and they may potentially change the design of, does that change how many poles in a series you need? And are there tools that help you design the system? Maybe, Andrew or Chad?
I think firstly, climate change is a huge thing. And I wanted to say one thing. We could think about what the climate is today, and we can use all of those maps. We can use all of those maps that are done by the NESC. But what we really need to be doing is thinking about what the climate's going to be in 2050, because the climate's going to change. And so looking at those maps and saying, in 2050, the top wind speed is going to be this. The top, the degree of icing is going to be that, is going to become really, really important. And, there's only two good times to plant an oak tree, 25 years ago and right now. And so we as an industry need to be building structures that are ready for 2050, not building structures that we're going to have to redo in the next 10 years because the climate has changed. And I think those are the tools that we do. And, EPRI's work, you've probably seen there's an initiative called Climate Ready. And that Climate Ready initiative is trying to work out how can we take all of those advanced models that the national labs that NOAA's doing, looking at the changes in the climate, and apply that to the T&D infrastructure and know what is the risk going to be, and then how can we harden and mitigate against it. And, that's obviously just one piece of it. There's load, there's a whole bunch of other pieces. But, that's a really, really important part. And I'm not sure I answered your question perfectly, but it's an interesting thing to think about.
There are a number of different programs out there that do structural load modeling on utility structures. And a lot of utilities are implementing and using those today, more so than they ever have before, and looking at things beyond minimum National Electric Safety Code standards. In addition to, many utilities have not put a big focus in the past on doing load modeling when a new attacher comes on. Now that has become a much bigger focus, especially with the big rural broadband build out. So they're getting some additional insight even from that effort, and doing that type of modeling can help understand where there might be weak points.
That's kind of what we're seeing too, is, when I started, our average pole was a 35 or 40 foot pole. Now most of the poles that we're setting are 45, 50, 55 foot. And that's all because of a load. That and EVs, we're pretty much hardening up our system because of those. So bigger conductors.
What else is on the pole? You drive down the street with an average person and they point to all the poles and they'll call them telephone poles. But and how does other things on the pole affect your ability to do work on it?
Honestly, the more things you put on the pole, obviously the more chaotic it gets, and the harder to work on. But that's kind of where we're going. When I started, it was you had a bunch of A1s, so they're just a straight line, single phase poles, might have a transformer on it. Now you're getting a bunch of fiber, cable boxes. The transformer might be way bigger now. We're adding crowbar arresters to help protect some of our underbuild on our other lines. There's a lot of stuff being added to poles, and honestly, it's a good thing, but it makes our job harder too.
So from a software perspective, I think your risk, most utilities have a GIS model, and whether it's you're using a software provider, sensor provider like Itron or somebody else, I think it's important that you start stacking risk based on your outage data. And so when you start thinking about pole standards and things, especially with new sensors that are new sales, basically, you imagine every single attachment is something that's going to catch wind and put stress on that pole, right? So us as utility designers or engineers, and us as people who are managing policy, we need to make sure that those people who connect to poles have the responsibilities of sharing that data collectively across utilities, whether it's Comcast, Turner, whoever, and said utility. We have to have some data share in order to stack the risk on those poles to know what the risk of a windstorm is going to have on pole X. And the design standards that has to change, especially when we move into a distributed generational world, is if consumers are going to basically serve microgrids, then that's the feeding source for that population, right? And we all know that there's a very distinct difference in what a feeder pole is versus a typical distribution secondary pole, right? And so I think that's something that we have to have some hard discussions on, because fundamentally that's going to change how we design our distributions.
And a lot of discussion around hardening comes down to, I think it's simplified, but do we underground or do we do something to the existing pole, or do we change out the pole? Sure. So I'm wondering if all of you can kind of talk about how those decisions, what goes into the decision about undergrounding versus keeping line above ground, but also the implications for all of that new technology that might be on the top of a pole, and what that means for the choices that have to be made.
So I mean, of course, if we go underground, it's 10 to 20 times more expensive. That's probably the main drive for that. The other thing too is in our northern territory, there's a lot of places where we just can't. It's nothing but rock. I mean, we can barely get a pole in the ground, let alone trying to bore for underground. So I feel like for us, it's one thing's the money, and two is the terrain.
So I think having worked for Florida Power and Light in Miami, I'm quite versed in underground and overhead. And what a lot of people, unfortunately, have this misconception that underground necessarily means more reliable. Yes, 90% of the time for those day-to-day storms, that might be the case. But when you start to have significant flood events or significant storm events, and you have an ungrounded fault underground, you have a massive failure of a circuit underground, the time to restore that is, weeks versus a matter of, 2 days or something of that matter. So I think there's a balance between where, to the point, are you doing this underground, in the downtown area, or is this rural territory? What is the cost versus the benefit? From a sensor perspective, I think when you think about restoration, getting there and understanding what is the issue is half the battle, and make sure you have the right resources to respond to the type of pole failure. And so, I think it's no secret that most folks now have accelerometers in most of their network gear from an AMI perspective, and so or streetlight sensors. So knowing which poles, having those types of alarms, so that when you're, am I taking 2 trucks and a pole truck, or I'm going to take in, a team of four different trucks and 12 guys to respond to this restoration event. I think that all impacts safety, because naturally having the right resources to respond will help you out. But when it comes to purely making the decisions for underground, it's, what does that cost per linear foot to put the conductor underground? And, years ago when I was doing it in downtown Miami, it was $1,500, right? So, that's a pole, right? And probably not today with inflation, who knows? But it was, that's
What does a
fundamentally
pole
driver.
cost? Like a 45-foot pole?
Probably $1,000 to $1,500, I would think.
Did you?
And that's just a small aspect of the overall cost of
Right.
actually implementing it and
Yeah, a
installing
lot of
it.
other stuff.
That's just the material.
Yep.
The only other thing to add from an undergrounding standpoint, right, the big one is cost. And the time in which, if there were to be an outage from the underground, you've got a much longer restoration time. One thing that I've heard from different utilities that has come into play that you may not think about is you own the pole as a pole owner, and you have third-party attachers paying rent.
Sure.
You're taking away your apartment complex that you're getting rent for and putting it underground, and you no longer have that revenue stream if you're keeping up with that. So that's another thing to consider. May not be a huge amount of money, but it's something to consider.
To add a few little things, I think when considering undergrounding today, increasingly we're going to have to think about disadvantaged communities, because disadvantaged communities will really benefit enormously from increasing the reliability and resiliency, because they're disproportionately affected when outages happen, right? If our whole refrigerator goes at home, we lose a few $100s because of all the stuff. For us, for me, maybe that's not a big deal. But if you're in a disadvantaged community, that's a big deal. You may not be able to, your kids may not be able to go to school, and because it's all remote and online. So while we're thinking about and prioritizing which circuits to underground, increasingly we're going to have to take that into account. And then I want to give a shout out. We have to reduce the cost of undergrounding, right? And RPE is about to launch, hopefully, a big program to reducing the cost of undergrounding. And we've been, many of you, we have a group called UDIG, which is trying to, underground distribution interest group that is trying to, pull together utilities, of 150 utilities that are collaborating to share information on how to do it. And I think we've really got to think about it. And, we need the government, we need RPE, we need to really think out of the box, to think of some amazing technology that is just going to reduce the cost. And that's make a huge difference. So
if the resilience funding does accelerate the replacement or hardening of the backbone of the grid, the utility poles, so we get this larger, faster turnover. You mentioned supply chain issues, but there's also the issue of the disposal of those poles. And I was at a shop on the Eastern Shore, and there was this beautiful white goose, and they were very proud to tell me that it was very heavy, and it was made of an old utility pole. But I think she called it a telephone pole. But I don't think that's the end of most poles, is to be a goose, a wooden goose. So can you talk a little bit about what that entails, the disposal of poles?
I think that's a major undertaking, if you want to know the truth. Our yard, just at our shop, we open it up to our members. They can come in if they want old utility poles, they can get them, but it doesn't happen very often. We've got some farmers that come around, cut fence posts out of them, but most of the time we chop them up and they go to the dump. There's not really a good solution right now for them, at least that I know about.
Yeah, they're essentially, it's disposal through the dump, letting them have a second life in a fence post or something somewhere. There are some areas where you can turn it into biofuel, but specific types of treatments are allowed for that, and specific areas will allow that. But otherwise, those are the end of life.
The treatments to prolong the life of the pole.
Correct. All utility poles are originally treated with a preservative, and those preservatives will last a certain amount of time within a utility pole and still have residual preservatives even after a long and useful life. But once those lose effectiveness to fight decay, there is still some preservative there, and they really shouldn't be used for burning. It's not firewood. That's not good. That's toxic to burn. Probably shouldn't be turning them into gooses or swans, because you've got some of those sawdust coming back into your face. But yeah, it's disposal in landfills, possible biofuel in the right areas and right treatment types, and then reuse in other second lives.
So how do utilities think about the chemical footprint of this network of poles?
Most of the all the preservative treatments stay within the pole and just lose its effectiveness over time or stay in that immediate vicinity. But they do have to be aware of the pesticide application and things of that nature. And that footprint, in many ways of looking at it, woodpoles.org is a great resource to look at the carbon footprint about utility poles versus other materials and how you apply them. So steel poles, fiberglass poles, they all have their certain carbon footprint, and wood is not as bad as you might think in terms of how they stack up.
So just a couple of interesting points. We have quite a few studies underway looking at the leaching of the preservatives into the ground and the affecting of the local thing. So if anyone's interested, there's a lot of new research coming on that. As an industry, we continue worrying about it, and we're doing our due diligence. And it's interesting, I was in Italy a few weeks ago and going to meet with them, strangely enough, on wood poles. And in Italy, they actually been using steel poles, turns out, for years. But with the new carbon initiative in Europe, they're looking at going back to wood poles, because the total carbon impact of a wood pole, of course, when you grow it, it's getting rid of CO2 out of it, and when you get rid of it, it's net zero almost. And while steel is significantly more. And so they're looking at how do we go back to wood poles and to reduce our carbon footprint and to meet our European Union requirements. So it's interesting that other people are thinking differently.
Yeah, and that may have some supply chain implications.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, I have literally another page of questions that I could ask, but I want to open up the floor for questions, if there are, for a panel. All right, I've got more questions. Let's go to the supply chain issues, because I've read the history of the land use change in the United States, and we in Canada and some of the European countries have had traditionally a huge forest stock, and the forests in the U.S. were depleted, the big tall trees by sail building in the 1800s, 17 and 1800s. you know, as we see taller poles, as we see, you know, changing land use, as we see countries that don't have forest resources growing out their electric distribution system, how do you see the supply chain issues affecting the availability of the poles?
I'll take a stab at the first one. We hear a lot from our utilities as of right now. There is a supply chain issue with wood utility poles. I would peg it mostly on this focus on resiliency. And some of the utilities are looking towards the quick answer, which is everything's a class bigger, everything's stronger. Only problem is trees don't grow that big, that prevalent. And so we end up with a standard that maybe engineering groups set that you can't actually implement without causing supply chain issues. So a blanket statement that every pole is going to be a class 2 pole or stronger across our system, there's not that many class 2 poles out there. And so there's other ways of thinking, maybe more poles but of smaller. The supply chain can handle the way the grid was built. The way we're trying to build it with wood, with bigger, fatter poles, it might not be able to support that.
I think you've hit that right on the head. It's got to be somewhere down the road. If we keep putting in bigger, taller poles, that at some point we're not going to be able to keep up with it, just because it takes so long to grow them to that size. I mean, that's what I see. But
Great. So one last question. Oh, is there a question? Larry. He's right behind you.
Go, Larry.
All right. Can't let you off the hook. Wildfire, what would you suggest? What's the best solution?
That is a big question, Larry. A really hard question to think about, right? Of course, there are lots of things that are being done. You know, one is wrapping undergrounding, of course, which would be the ultimate beautiful solution. If you look at PG&E's announcement, 10,000 miles underground, which is really all distribution. But there are places you can't underground, you know, where you've got very rocky terrain and it doesn't absolutely make sense at all. So there are many solutions, there are many not solutions, no silver bullet, but there are many things to be done. You know, of course, thinking about the pole and putting fire protection on, you know, fire protective wraps, et cetera, for the pole not to be degraded, that's definitely one piece of the puzzle. It's putting in, you know, special protection that's going to, you know, pull out faster. It's thinking about new designs where branches don't actually bridge the phases the way we think about, if we think about the phasing where we're doing testing, where branches don't bridge and cause fires. It's thinking about all of the attachment hardware that when you have an arc, does not catch a light and, you know, plastic falling to the ground. So there are so many facets to making that structure more fire resilient, if that would be the right way to think about it. It's just, and it is a huge undertaking, and it has, and it's no one part of it can be done by itself. It is a, in my mind, a multifaceted thing, and you've got to think about all of them.
And are there also things that are on the pole that help you with managing your risks of wildfire? Yeah, I think.
So, you know, with edge computing, we have the capabilities of looking at the data that would see kind of a contact or a vegetation contact in real time that would make an indication that maybe a tree, depending on the framing, you know, has a contact that would be indicative of something that might start a fire. You know, from risk stacking perspective, back to you know, from a research perspective, I think when you look at I don't know, you know, aerial cable obviously prevents, you know, even if there's a contact, reduces the risk of fire. But then there's other safety issues associated with that as well. But I mean, I think if you take the data that you have against the failures and the things that are known, root cause analysis, layer it in your analytics tools, layer it with the data that you're getting from your sensors, you can drive the standards for your environment. And I want to make sure that everybody understands what I'm saying here is that because one utility defines the standard for them, doesn't mean that that's the right standard for your environment, given the vegetation growth, the environmental impact, the things that impact your geographic territory, you know, is going to be unique than, you know, from next utility. So, you know, the fact that you have institutions like EPRI that let you go there, test different framing standards, align it with the data and the solutions that you have can help you uniquely define the standard that protects you best.
Got a question here.
Nakabari Goka again, Exxon Utilities. So before I get to my question, let me take the time to shout out Chad. It's always good to meet people from home, fellow graduate of the Georgia Institute of Technology. So, you know, good to shout out my alma mater there. So my question, in you guys' experience with utilities, I think there's a cost associated with making the transition to some of these newer pole technologies. That's the hard physical cost of the material. Can you talk a bit about your experience with utilities, talking about the change management cost associated with training folks up? Because I think sometimes with our regulatory commissions, the material costs are very, very easy to define, right? The change management costs, I think, are where it's a bit, you know, squishing it. And in today's environment where I think we are experiencing a lot of pressures from the regulatory commissions about keeping costs down, having some insight into that might be useful for us as well.
I mean, for us, anything new that we're putting on a pole, we end up going to pretty much a training class, hands-on. This is how it works, you know, and I mean, that takes time. You're paying for that. And then sometimes with some of it, it takes more people to actually construct it. So, I mean, you know, you might be saving $1 or $2 here or there, and then you end up spending a lot more on training and getting it actually in the air, so.
I think one thing to add, like if you're thinking of new designs, you think of new materials like composite materials, the one thing that you've got to also include in your cost is your warehousing and the ability that you've got all these different standards on your truck, right? Okay, and that you've got all these different attachment hardware. And when you're out troubleshooting in the middle of the night and you don't have the right attachment for a composite pole because the composite pole stuff's in the warehouse somewhere, and you end up drilling a hole and making it work, that in 5 years later, when you have the next event, it actually makes it less reliable. And so you've got all of these knock-on standards that you have to think about, and it's from warehousing to you know, to standards management, and there's a whole bunch of things that come on together, and there's these knock-on effects that are often not taken into account when you come up with new ideas.
And to your point, Andrew, I mean, that's a great point because that happens a lot. Instead of driving an hour and a half back to the shop at 2 o'clock in the morning, we make it work. And that gets turned in, at least for us, but do we ever make it back out there? I don't know. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we have an event come through before we can make it back out, so.
Maybe I could ask you a question just a little bit aligned with that, is like when you have mutual response and you have other people come in, you know, who are not used to your system, how does that impact that type of thing?
Oh, big time, because one, you know, our fuse size. So we have different, we use T's, they might use QAs, they might use K. I mean, you know, and then the way they build things might be a little bit different. The material that they use might be different. So you end up getting, after a major storm, you end up getting a hodgepodge of all kinds of things. And you'll be driving down the road one day and you'll be like, what in the world is that? You know what I mean? Like, so, yeah, when we have mutual aid assistance, it's, you don't know what you're getting. So,
This is a great panel. Thank you very much for this. I learned tons, and I.
Karen, I did have one question.
Oh, Karen, yeah, Mr. Johnson.
Just quickly, how about people? Are you getting people to do the job you do?
that's a tough question. On the lineman's,
Who's
on
going
the
to
lineman
replace
side of
you?
thing,
Yeah.
I feel like there's a huge shortage. We've got so many people retiring. I think it was like 60% of our workforce was retiring in the next couple of years. And to get people to replace that is, it's getting hard. Even though there are a lot of young people going into the trades, but I don't think it's keeping up with what's going across the industry, in all honesty.
Great. Well, thank you, guys. Appreciate it. And I do want to just take a few minutes to issue some more thank yous. First, to our sponsors. We had more sponsors this year than we have in quite a while, so I'm not going to read them off. But you made it possible for us to hold this 2022 GridCONNEXT and here in Convene as well. Because we love this space, and we want to thank everybody at Convene for really helping to host us and make things smooth. Our team certainly has been working on this for months and months. Stephanie Dernick, Malika Scott, Josh Steinhardt, Makiba Scott and Malika Walton, and Richie O'Neill. Thank you to you all, and thanks to everybody here for sitting here and being fully engaged for a day and a half. There's another 2 hours later on this afternoon after lunch that we hope you'll stay for, because it'll really help us figure out how we can be most of value going forward in the next couple of years as this infrastructure funding starts flowing. So thanks to everybody, and we'll see you over lunch. Richie, anything else? All right, see you at lunch.